Reading from For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA Official, and the Best Evacuation Story Not Yet Heard. This is February 1975. February brought the celebration of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. Traditionally, it provided one of the few long breaks during the agricultural year between the harvesting of the crops and the sowing of the next ones. Essentially, for the Vietnamese, it is a combination of the festivity and good times of Christmas and New Year's Eve. Our family was drawn into the celebrations when Hoa, she was our cook, and the maids and Mr. B bought and cooked us a traditional Vietnamese dinner at our house. Since 1968, the holiday had become inextricably linked with the most dramatic turning point of the war. Known as the Tet Offensive, the massive Viet Cong attack effectively tipped the war in the North's favor, despite the fact that they sustained major losses and were essentially crippled by the effort. It was the visual footage of the Tet battles that soured the American public's support of the troops in Vietnam. How, after 3 years of fighting and hundreds of thousands of troops, could the enemy still mount such an attack? The images and echoes of it still hung in the air in 1974, a dark underscore to the otherwise happy event. Tet is really upon us, and we are all praying that it will be a quiet one, wrote my mother, adding that she hoped the war didn't flare up too badly. I realize how bad it all sounds there, much worse than it seems here. Despite her assurances, she went on to admit that the House 7 employees were not feeling safe and were, in fact, making dire plans to avoid the wrath of the communists should their offensive continue. Jim asked Mylon, the radio star, what her family would do if the commies took over and they could not get out. She said, "My father will shoot us and then he will commit suicide." It just seems unreal, my mother wrote. However, there is a plan to get certain people out if necessary. Anyway, Tet is a time of happiness for the new year, mixed with anxiety. Ambassador Martin's official line of optimism was being passed on to the families in an effort to assuage any panic that might be taking root. Our leaders gave us a briefing the other day, my mother continued, in late February. I'm still not quite sure what he said, but he doesn't see the country falling in the foreseeable future, and we are as safe here or as in any large city in the U.S. So Mom and Dad, don't worry. Such confusing messages were putting her on edge, but she tried valiantly to stay positive, describing a visit to an orphanage in Gia Ding for an afternoon mass and an open house. But even in that, she couldn't get away from the growing truth. It is a beautiful area and so quiet and peaceful by day. By night, it is war. The same conflicted messages were being agonized over in Washington. Persistent requests for funding finally prompted select members of Congress to travel to Vietnam to see for themselves what was transpiring a half a world away. One of these inquiries was Representative Pete McCloskey of California, who immediately saw through the unsubstantiated messages of those on the ground in Saigon. After a visit in late February and early March of 75, he was no clearer on how the U.S. aid would benefit the turbulent situation. Graham Martin and his station chief Polgar were incapable of giving a fair appraisal to a visiting team of congressmen, he said. They were so emotionally wrapped up in the desire to save South Vietnam. Martin was saying the Vietnamese can stand. All you have to do is give them more ammunition and more equipment. The delegation returned to the States unconvinced by this display of blind optimism, and no further support was extended to the South Vietnamese army. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese were advancing their plans diligently, if carefully. Three divisions were deployed to surround the city of Ban Mae Thuot in South Vietnamese Central Highlands. NVA artillery units shelled steadily for days so that the Southern soldiers could not hear the tanks moving into place for a planned attack in early March. My father was planning to take Chris, Mike, and John in a trang for a few days to fish and snorkel to their heart's content. The resort town was just 115 miles southeast of the well-disguised military buildup taking place in Ban Mae Thuot. Unfortunately for their mid-February trip, the resort town was canceled due to logistical issues. A fellow CIA agent later reported that he and his son had visited the area just months earlier, when the fighting had been much quieter, only to narrowly miss being hit by a half-dozen Viet Cong B-40 rockets. One landed just 50 yards from them, leaving a hole a foot deep and 2 feet across. So that was February 1975. Thanks for joining me for this reading of For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA official, and the best evacuation story not yet heard.